The lonely rancher paid $1 for a fat woman with a burlap sack over her head and married her before dawn in a candlelit church that smelled of old wood and desperation. Thunder rolled across the Wyoming territory as Arthur Morgan stood beside his bride, watching the nervous preacher rush through vows that felt more like a business transaction than a sacred ceremony. Dutch van der Linde folded the crumpled dollar bill into his vest pocket. His smile never reached his eyes. The woman beside Arthur breathed heavily through the rough fabric covering her face. Her bulky frame shifted in the flickering light. The preacher's voice trembled. Arthur wondered if the man had ever performed a wedding at midnight with a storm brewing outside. Probably not. Most weddings happened in daylight with families present and hope in the air. This felt like something that belonged in shadows. When the moment came to kiss his bride, Arthur's hands shook as he lifted the burlap sack. He expected to see the weathered face of a woman who had given up on beauty long ago. Instead, he found himself staring into the startled green eyes of someone young and lovely, Ellie Williams. That was the name she had whispered during the ceremony. Now she looked as shocked as he felt. Her face was pale but striking, with high cheekbones and full lips that trembled slightly. This was not the woman Dutch had described. The kiss was brief and awkward. Both of them stepped back immediately. The preacher declared them married. Dutch tipped his hat and disappeared into the storm. Arthur and Ellie stood in the empty church, listening to rain hammer the roof. The ride back to the ranch passed in silence. Ellie kept her hood up and her bulky coat wrapped tight around her body. Arthur stole glances at her profile when lightning illuminated the wagon. She was beautiful. That much was certain. Everything else was a mystery. 24 hours earlier, Arthur had been a different man. Hope had not yet died in his chest. He had stood in his kitchen reading the foreclosure notice for the third time, as if the words might change. 3 days to pay $500, or lose everything his father had built. The cattle were dead. All of them. Some strange sickness had swept through the herd like wildfire. Arthur had watched his livelihood rot in the fields while creditors circled like vultures. He was 35 years old and facing ruin. Sadie Adler had mentioned Dutch's wagon when she brought him soup that evening. Women seeking new lives out west. Arrangements could be made for the right price. Arthur had laughed bitterly. What woman would want a failing rancher with calloused hands and an empty future? But desperation made men consider impossible things. Late that night, Arthur had walked to the saloon where Dutch held court. The man spoke in riddles and promises. $1 for a fresh start. A woman who needed protection in exchange for companionship. No questions asked. Arthur had looked at the dollar in his palm, his last dollar. The choice between buying coffee or buying a wife seemed equally absurd. He chose the wife. Now she sat beside him in the wagon, this mysterious woman who was nothing like what he had expected. Her breathing was steady despite the storm. Her hands, though gloved, seemed delicate where they gripped the wagon seat. Everything about her suggested refinement, not desperation. Back at the ranch, Arthur showed her to the small bedroom off the kitchen. He would sleep in the barn until proper arrangements could be made. She nodded without speaking. The bulky coat made her movements awkward, but he caught glimpses of grace underneath. Morning came gray and cold. Arthur found Ellie in the kitchen, still wearing her oversized clothing. She had made coffee and eggs. The smell filled the house with something approaching comfort. They ate in silence. Arthur watched her careful movements, the way she held her cup with both hands, how she kept her eyes down. She was hiding something beyond her face. Her whole body seemed like a disguise. After breakfast, Arthur went to check the horses. When he returned, he found Ellie sitting at his desk with papers spread before her. She looked up quickly, guilt flashing across her face. The papers were his financial records. Bills and loans and notices all jumbled together in no particular order. Arthur felt heat rise in his cheeks. His shame was laid bare for this stranger to see. Ellie spoke for the first time since their vows. Her voice was soft but educated, with an accent that suggested cities and schooling. She asked about his bookkeeping system. Arthur admitted he had none. Numbers had never been his strength. She offered to help organize things. Arthur hesitated, then nodded. What did he have to lose? She was his wife now, whatever that meant. His problems were her problems. As Ellie worked, Arthur noticed how quickly she moved through the documents. Her fingers found patterns he had never seen. She made notes in neat handwriting that put his scrawl to shame. This was not the work of a simple woman seeking shelter. By noon, she had created order from chaos. Arthur's debt was still crushing, but at least now he could see its true shape. Ellie had found discrepancies in some of the loan documents. Small things, but potentially important. The afternoon brought a rider. Arthur watched from the window as a stranger approached the house. The man was well-dressed, with hard eyes that searched the property carefully. He asked about newcomers to the area. Arthur said he knew of none. After the rider left, Arthur found Ellie pressed against the kitchen wall, her face pale with fear. She had been watching from the shadows. When he asked what was wrong, she claimed sudden illness and retreated to her room. That evening, Arthur sat on his porch and tried to make sense of his situation. He had married a beautiful, educated woman who was clearly running from something. She had brought danger to his doorstep, but also hope. For the first time in months, his papers were organized and his kitchen smelled like home. The wind carried the scent of rain and possibility. Arthur Morgan had gambled his last dollar on a mystery. Now he had to decide whether to trust the woman who might save him or destroy him. Thunder rumbled in the distance. The storm was not finished with them yet. The days that followed moved with the rhythm of cautious partnership. Ellie worked through Arthur's financial maze while maintaining her bulky disguise. Her fingers traced loan documents and bank statements with the precision of someone who understood the language of money and power. Arthur watched her from the kitchen doorway. The way she held her pen spoke of schooling beyond what most women received. Her handwriting flowed across pages with educated grace. When she thought he wasn't looking, her posture straightened into something almost regal. She had found something in his papers. A clause buried deep in the original loan agreement. Arthur couldn't follow her explanation, but hope flickered in her voice when she spoke of legal precedents and territorial banking laws. She needed time to research further. The barn had become Arthur's refuge. He slept in the hay loft and worked on broken harnesses while his mind wrestled with questions he couldn't ask. His wife was a mystery wrapped in oversized clothing and careful words, but she was trying to save him. That was worth something. 3 days into their strange marriage, Ellie suggested they avoid town for a while. She claimed to be shy around strangers, uncomfortable with curious stares. Arthur agreed, though he noticed how her eyes searched the horizon whenever riders approached. The isolation suited them both. Away from prying eyes, Ellie's rigid posture softened slightly. She still wore her bulky coat, but Arthur caught glimpses of quick movement beneath the fabric, grace trying to hide itself. They worked together in the makeshift infirmary Arthur had built for sick cattle. 2 calves had survived the mysterious disease that killed the rest. Ellie knelt beside the weaker one, her gloved hands gentle on its fevered head. The calf was dying. Arthur knew the signs, but Ellie mixed herbs with the confidence of someone who had done this before. She spoke to the animal in a voice that dropped its careful inflection. Her natural accent emerged, crisp and eastern. Arthur pretended not to notice. The calf lived. That evening, they sat on the porch while sunset painted the sky the color of old copper. Ellie had removed her hood, though she kept her coat wrapped tight. Her hair caught the dying light, dark strands that had escaped their careful pins. She asked about his father. Arthur spoke of a man who had built this ranch from nothing, who had believed in the promise of land and hard work. His voice carried the weight of inheritance and failure. Ellie listened without offering empty comfort. When Arthur finished speaking, she simply nodded. Understanding passed between them, wordless and complete. They were both carrying the expectations of dead dreams. The stranger arrived 2 days later. Arthur saw him from the pasture, a well-dressed man on a fine horse, asking questions at the front door. Ellie had vanished, but Arthur felt her watching from somewhere in the shadows. The man introduced himself as Joel Miller. He worked for railroad. Interests: tracking down stolen property. A woman had disappeared from St. Louis with valuable documents. There might be a reward for information. Arthur's face remained neutral. He knew nothing of stolen property or missing women. Miller's eyes searched the ranch buildings before he rode away. The dust of his departure hung in the air long after he disappeared. That night, Arthur found Ellie in the kitchen, her hands shaking as she tried to pour coffee. The cup rattled against the saucer. She set it down carefully and pressed her palms flat against the table. Arthur sat across from her. He didn't ask questions. Sometimes silence was the only kindness a man could offer. Ellie spoke into the stillness. Her voice was barely above a whisper. She had worked for a lawyer's family in St. Louis, she had learned. Things about railroad business that powerful men wanted to keep hidden. Coming west had been her only choice. Arthur studied her face in the lamplight. Truth and lies twisted together in her words, but the fear was genuine. Whatever she was running from had teeth. He made a decision without speaking it aloud. His ranch would be her sanctuary for as long as she needed it. The law could sort itself out later. The next morning brought news that changed everything. Sadie Adler rode over with word from town. Dutch van der Linde had disappeared in the night, leaving behind only empty bottles and unpaid debts. The women he had brought west were on their own. Arthur watched Ellie absorb this information. Her face went pale beneath her hood. Dutch had been her lifeline, her connection to whatever network had brought her here. Now that thread was cut. But something else shifted in her expression, relief mixed with the fear. She was free from Dutch's control, even if it meant facing her pursuers alone. Arthur made coffee while Ellie stared out the window at the endless grassland. The wind moved through the wheat in patterns that reminded him of water, of waves carrying things away from shore. She turned from the window and began to speak. Her voice carried new resolve. She had found a way to save his ranch, but it would require a trip to the county seat. The legal documents she needed were in the territorial courthouse. Arthur knew the county seat. Railroad money bought influence there. Men like Joel Miller would have friends in official places. It was dangerous ground for a woman, running from powerful enemies, but it was also their only chance. Ellie met his eyes across the kitchen table. For the first time since their wedding night, she looked directly at him without flinching. Her green eyes held depths he was only beginning to understand. She was asking him to trust her, not just with his ranch, but with both their lives. The woman who had cost him $1 might be worth everything he had left. Arthur nodded once. They would go to the county seat together. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the scent of distant storms. Change was coming whether they were ready or not. The only choice was whether to face it together or apart. Arthur Morgan had learned that $1 could buy more than he had ever imagined. It could buy hope. It could buy partnership. It could buy a future neither of them had dared to dream. The real question was whether they would lung enough to claim it. The plan to save Arthur's ranch required documents that could only be found in the county courthouse. Ellie spread territorial maps across the kitchen table, her finger tracing the route to the seat of power where railroad money bought justice and men like Joel Miller held sway. Arthur watched her calculate distances and dangers. She knew the risks better than he did. The county seat was enemy territory, but it held the legal precedents that could prove the railroad's illegal seizure methods. Without those documents, his ranch would fall to foreclosure in 2 days. Ellie's hands moved across the maps with the precision of someone who had studied geography in expensive schools. Her knowledge of territorial law ran deeper than any lawyer's. Wife should possess. Arthur no longer pretended not to notice these inconsistencies. She was more than she claimed to be. Much more. The morning of their departure brought unexpected revelation. Arthur had risen early to prepare the wagon when he heard sounds from the kitchen. Through the window, he watched Ellie washing at the basin, her bulky coat draped over a chair. Without her disguise, she was revealed as slender and graceful. The padding that had created her false silhouette lay scattered across the floor. Arthur stood frozen, watching this stranger who was his wife transform before his eyes. Ellie turned and saw him at the window. Time stopped between them. Her real face, free of shadows and concealment, was more beautiful than he had remembered from their wedding night. But it was also younger, more vulnerable than the careful persona she had maintained. She dressed quickly, but the pretense was shattered. When Arthur entered the kitchen, they faced each other across a chasm of unspoken truths. Arthur's voice was quiet when he finally spoke. He asked her real name. Not the name she had whispered during their midnight ceremony, but the name she had carried before fear drove her west. Ellie Williams, she said. It was the truth, but not the whole truth. Arthur could see layers beneath the admission, secrets that ran deeper than a false marriage or stolen documents. She began to speak, words tumbling out in a rush of confession. She had been married before to a man named Micah Bell who worked for the Railroad Consortium. But it was not a marriage of choice. Micah had used legal trickery and family pressure to bind her to him. The documents she carried were not just evidence of railroad crimes. They were proof that Micah's company had deliberately poisoned cattle across the territory, creating financial desperation that forced ranchers to sell at reduced prices. Arthur's dead herd was not the victim of natural disease, but calculated murder. Arthur sat heavily in his chair. The woman he had married for $1 was the key to destroying the men who had destroyed him. She had not brought danger to his doorstep. She had brought justice. But justice came with a price. Micah would never stop hunting her. The railroad had resources that stretched across territories and bought loyalty in every courthouse. Fighting them meant risking everything Arthur had left. Ellie offered to leave. She could disappear into the vast western emptiness, carry her secrets far from his failing ranch. Arthur would be safe from her enemies, free to find some other way to save his land. Arthur looked at this woman who had shared his table and organized his chaos. She had tended his sick cattle and brought order to his crumbling world. In the space of a week, she had become essential to his daily existence. More than that, she had become something he had never expected to find: a partner. Someone who understood that survival required more than strength or stubbornness. It required intelligence and courage and the willingness to fight for what mattered. Arthur made his choice without hesitation. They would go to the county seat together. They would face Micah and his railroad masters as husband and wife, as partners in a battle that had been forced upon them both. Ellie's eyes filled with tears she refused to shed. She had expected abandonment, had prepared herself for another betrayal. Instead, she found loyalty from a man who barely knew her real name. They spent the afternoon preparing for war. Arthur cleaned his father's rifle while Ellie organized the documents that would either save them or seal their fate. The evidence was damning, but presenting it would require reaching a judge before Micah's influence could silence them. Sadie Adler arrived as the sun began to set. She had heard rumors of trouble, had seen Joel Miller asking questions in town. When Arthur explained their situation, Sadie's weathered face hardened with familiar anger. Her own ranch had suffered mysterious cattle deaths 2 years earlier. She had been forced to sell to rail representatives at a fraction of the land's value. The pattern was clear now: the systematic destruction of independent ranchers who stood in the way of railroad expansion. Other neighbors joined them as word spread. Men who had lost everything to the same mysterious cattle disease. Women who had watched their husbands drink themselves to death after losing the family land. The railroad had left a trail of broken dreams across the territory. They would ride together to the county seat, not as individual victims, but as a united force demanding justice. Ellie's documents would be their weapon, and Arthur's ranch would be their rallying point. The night before their departure, Arthur found Ellie standing in the moonlight beside his father's grave. She had removed her bulky coat, no longer hiding her true form. The woman who had cost him $1 stood revealed as someone worth dying for. She turned when she heard his footsteps. Her face was peaceful despite the dangers that awaited them. She had found something in this windswept ranch that she had never expected to discover: a home, a purpose, a man who would stand beside her when the whole world turned against them. Arthur stood beside her in the silver light. Tomorrow would bring violence or vindication. Tonight, there was only the quiet companionship of two people who had found each other in the vast loneliness of the frontier. The wind moved through the grass, carrying the scent of distant storms. Change was coming with the dawn, and they would meet it together. The county seat rose from the prairie dust like a monument to ambition and corruption. Arthur guided the wagon through streets lined with brick buildings that spoke of railroad money and Eastern influence. Beside him, Ellie sat straight-backed and tense, her documents hidden beneath her coat. They had hours before Micah Bell arrived with his legal papers and bought judges. Hours to present their case before the machinery of influence could grind them into dust. The courthouse dominated the town square, its clock tower casting shadows that moved across the street like the hands of fate. Arthur helped Ellie down from the wagon, his calloused fingers briefly touching her gloved hand. She squeezed once, a gesture that carried more weight than words. Seti Adler and the other ranchers had positioned themselves around the square. They looked like what they were: hard people who had been pushed too far. The railroad had made enemies of the wrong folk. Judge Hosea Matthews was older than Arthur had expected, with silver hair and eyes that had seen too much of human nature. He listened as Ellie presented her evidence, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. The documents painted a picture of systematic destruction. Cattle poisoned, loans called in early, legal technicalities used to steal land from families who had worked it for generations. The railroad consortium had turned theft into a business model. Micah Bell arrived as the afternoon sun slanted through the courthouse windows. He was younger than Arthur had imagined, with the kind of handsome face that concealed cruelty. His expensive suit and confident stride announced his certainty of victory. Behind him walked Joe Miller and two other men who wore their violence openly. They took seats in the back of the courtroom, their presence a reminder that law was only as strong as the men who enforced it. Micah's voice filled the courtroom when he spoke. He claimed ownership of both the woman and the evidence she carried: marriage contracts and property rights, legal precedents that reduced human beings to possessions. But Ellie had prepared for this moment. Her voice cut through Micah's bluster with the precision of a blade. She presented proof that her original marriage had been obtained through coercion and fraud. Documents that showed Micah's pattern of forcing women into legal bondage. Arthur watched the judge's face as the evidence mounted. Hosea Matthews had built his reputation on fairness, and that reputation was being tested by the weight of railroad gold and the threat of violence. The courtroom filled with tension thick as smoke. Every person present understood that more than one ranch hung in the balance. The railroad's entire scheme of territorial conquest faced exposure. Micah's composure cracked when Ellie produced the final document. A letter in his own handwriting, detailing the cattle poisoning operation and naming the chemical compounds used. Evidence that transformed business into murder. The judge called for recess. Arthur and Ellie waited in the hallway while justice weighed itself against influence. Through the windows they could see more railmen arriving in town. Time was running out. When court resumed, Judge Matthews spoke with the authority of a man who had decided to risk everything for the truth. He declared Ellie's marriage to Micah null and void, obtained through illegal means. Her union with Arthur was recognized as legitimate and binding. More importantly, the evidence of cattle poisoning was accepted as proof of criminal conspiracy. Warrants were issued for Micah Bell and his associates. The railroad would face federal investigation. Micah's face transformed into something ugly and desperate. He started to rise from his seat, his hand moving toward his coat. Joel Miller, tensed behind him, ready to turn the courthouse into a battlefield. Arthur stepped forward, placing himself between Micah and Ellie. He made no threatening moves, simply stood with the quiet strength of a man defending what mattered to him. The other ranchers shifted in their seats, ready to follow his lead. The moment stretched taut as a bowstring. Then federal marshals entered the courtroom, drawn by the judge's urgent telegram. Micah Bell was arrested without the violence he had planned. His empire of stolen land began to crumble in the space of a heartbeat. 6 months later, Arthur stood in the same church where he had married a stranger for $1. This time sunlight streamed through clean windows and filled the sanctuary with golden warmth. Ellie walked toward him in a white dress that revealed her true grace and beauty. The whole community had gathered to witness their renewal of vows. Sadie Adler dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. The ranchers who had fought beside them smiled with the satisfaction of justice served. The railroad had paid restitution to every family affected by their poisoning scheme. Arthur's ranch thrived again, but more than that, it had become a sanctuary for women fleeing difficult circumstances. Ellie had found her calling in helping others escape the shadows she had once hidden in. When the preacher asked if anyone objected to the union, Arthur caught Ellie's eye and smiled. She had told him the night before that she would charge $2 for her services next time. He had laughed and said it would still be a bargain. They kissed as husband and wife for the second time, but this kiss carried no desperation or fear. It tasted of hope and shared purpose, of a future they had built together from the wreckage of their separate pasts. The sun climbed higher as they walked from the church, casting short shadows that would lengthen into evening and then disappear entirely. Arthur had learned that some gambles paid dividends beyond imagination. $1 had bought him more than a wife. It had bought him a partner, a cause, and a love that would endure whatever storms the future might bring. The wind moved through the grass around the church, carrying the scent of growing things and new beginnings. In the distance, cattle grazed on land that would never again be stolen by men who mistook power for justice. Arthur Morgan had paid $1 for a fat woman with a sack on her head. He had received a queen who helped him build a kingdom worth defending. And that is all to the story for now. Please let me know where you are tuning in from. Perhaps we will create a story there. Consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel. And if you enjoy our content, click this video on your screen. I promise you, it's worth watching. See you tomorrow.